In London is Geoffrey Nice. He is a law professor at Gresham College. He was also involved with the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and was the lead prosecutor at the trial of the former Serbian president Slobodan Milosevic. Geoffrey, thank you so much for your time. And clearly you'll have to forgive my lack of expertise in the legal field. I just wanted to start by asking you, when you were prosecuting Milosevic, when there were suspected war crimes, were you looking at whether he ordered them or whether he just knew about them?
Well, it was both. But knowledge is also sufficient to prove responsibility, because if you know that something's being committed and being committed in your name or by those who are subject to your control, then your first duty is to issue an order that they should stop what you're doing. And indeed, you should then bring them back to base in order that they can be tried for war crimes. And so the question of knowledge is, in a sense, merges almost immediately in the case of the leadership of a well-publicized law with the business of control and command. But let's also be realistic. In this conflict, there's never been any doubt from the beginning that what's being done, and what's being done that's clearly criminal, at the very worst level of criminality, was commanded by Putin. There's no need to get too technical or to err too far in favor of assuming innocence on the part of somebody who's clearly shown not to be innocent.
Okay, well, look, let's get into some specific details of particular moments of what's happening in Ukraine in a moment. But first, to look at the bigger picture of accountability. Clearly, that's never going to happen within Russia because Vladimir Putin in 2021 signed into law after a referendum a new law that means that he and his family are going to be immune from prosecution for life. But what about the potential of international accountability?
Well, first of all, you mentioned Milosevic. It was never thought that he'd be handed over, but there was regime change and he was. So Putin can't expect necessarily to live in isolation in Russia for the rest of his life. However, if he or his interest group stays in power, or if he's replaced by somebody who doesn't wish to hand him over, then there's no way that the international community will be able to bring him to trial. And so that the International Criminal Court will probably be able to go no further than to issue an indictment against him, waiting for somebody to hand him over if he's foolish enough as to travel. So yes, there's a real difficulty with an actual trial, unless those in Russia or those where he happens to find himself are willing to hand him over.
Is there such a thing as a gradation of war crimes? We have Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, also the investigative website Bellingcat, saying that they all have proof of cluster bombs being dropped on civilian neighborhoods. One hit a nursery and a kindergarten, for example. How does that differ to, say, a Russian jet dropping a missile on fleeing civilians?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm able to grade things. They're all totally appalling, dreadful, and wickedly criminal. And we should, I think, see this as an opportunity for cutting through the complexities that lawyers and judges sometimes really enjoy, and looking at this from the point of view of the public. There is the clearest possible evidence available to all of us of grave crimes, and each of them needs to be looked at and prosecuted. But they don't need to be looked at that hard because the evidence is on our screens all day, every day. And I hope that the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, who's investigating at the moment, will say he's got enough evidence pretty quickly in order to start having an indictment preferred against this man. Of course, your excellent introduction to the complexities of the Geneva Conventions, and there are also another series of conventions, the Hague Conventions, which are very important in the history. But your excellent introduction only overlooked one thing, and that is that the crime of aggression, which is now within the statute of the International Criminal Court, probably cannot be levied against Putin, even at the level of an indictment, without the consent of the Security Council. And this brings in sharpest possible focus the stupidity of the position in which we find ourselves, where Russia remains a member of the Security Council with a veto, able to stop parts of the legal process being pursued. And if I say it's stupid, and hear diplomats around the world saying, You can't stop Russia being a member. Just think of this. It is the equivalent of Hitler, had he survived, and Goering, and maybe Ribbentrop, sitting on a committee in 1944-5 that had the ability to veto the bringing of the Nuremberg trials. We really have got to confront the fact that the Security Council veto held by Russia is a nonsense and must be dealt with straightforwardly by our political leaders.
Geoffrey, I have to say that I have heard from sources within the United States, and extremely formally high-level sources in Washington, that actually this could be the moment that the Security Council is actually disbanded and the United Nations as a whole is run in a different way. As a professor of law, do you think that possibly should happen?
I'm not really technically sufficiently aware as to know whether it can technically happen at the moment. But again, just think what the victims and the public generally, whose interest in all these matters has finally been triggered and released by seeing these images, what would they want? They would not want a Security Council on which two members are run by dictators, one being run by a dictator who's committing these dreadful crimes against wholly innocent people, including, as we now know, a large number of children who have been killed. So if the momentum is there to disband the present Security Council and proceed by another way, I'm pretty sure you'd find that the public would want it. And I, as a person who's been involved in these things, would certainly want that matter seriously considered and taken forward.
Geoffrey, always appreciate your time and your analyses, very much so. Geoffrey Nice in London.